Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and today on episode 64, we have the pleasure of having Matthew Daddona, a ghostwriter and author whose journey from his ancestral roots to the North Fork and beyond is as rich as his storytelling. Matthew shares his intimate details of his upbringing and how his early years on the North Fork shaped his outlook on life and love for writing. We explore pivotal moments in his career, from college to a serendipitous internship at Penguin Publishing, offering a candid glimpse into the inner workings of the literary world, as well as his work in journalism and his writing process. Discover the world through Matthew's eyes as he discusses the art of ghostwriting and the personal journey that inspired his debut novel, The Longitude of Grief. Beyond writing, Matthew's commitment to community shines through his volunteer work at the Southold Fire Department, revealing a deep-seated passion for service and connection. And lastly, Matthew offers his hopes and dreams for the future of the North Fork and beyond. So I hope you enjoy episode 64 with Matthew Daddona. This episode was recorded April 18th, 2024. Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Christopher. Appreciate it.
No problem. And I'd like to just start off, if you could give us a little introduction about yourself, where you were born and raised.
Yeah, absolutely. I moved to the North Fork when I was 15 years old. So my parents up and left this Nassau County town called Lawrence, which is part of the Five Towns, where they were sort of born and raised, and came to the North Fork, to a much smaller community and a much smaller school. I went from a school of 400 in my class to 99 at Southold. Yeah, and I remember one of my first days there, the guidance counselor, who was a wonderful person, she had taken me aside and she was like, "If you're ever overwhelmed by the size of your class, just let me know. 99 is a huge number for Southold." And I was like, think I'll be okay. But I really came into my own here, and I sort of I would attribute a lot of what I'm interested in as a writer, as an artist, as a person, to the North Fork and to moving here at a pretty impressionable young age. So I lived here. I lived in Southold until I went to school. I went to Temple University and then Brooklyn College. I moved to the city for a bunch of years where I worked in publishing, and about 2.5 years ago I moved back to the North Fork. So now it's an interesting contrast to see it as an adult and see how much has not changed and how much has.
Yes. And in terms of your parents and ancestry, but how far back can you go in terms of your earliest ancestors, whether it's on your mother or father's side?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because frankly, I hadn't looked into much of it until you and I started talking about ancestry and some of your focus here. And while I knew some of my history, there were kind of elements and gems I discovered just over the last couple months, and even just up until a few days ago. So my mom was born in Brooklyn, in Brighton Beach. She had lived there as a kid before moving to Lawrence, Cedarhurst. My dad was born on Long Island, had basically spent his life in the town in which I grew up. And my last name, which is Daddona, is an Italian last name that comes from his parents who had adopted him. So they're not his biological parents. They're his adopted parents who came from a town called Benevento in Naples. They were immigrants to this country, literally built the house that my father and I grew up in. My grandfather worked as a landscaper, and my grandmother worked in schools as a kind of, and doing some odd jobs here and there. And I was fortunate enough to have a really close relationship to them until their deaths, about when I was about 8 years old. So really formative memories of growing up in a household that they spoke Italian in. They watched soccer, in afternoons. They had long suppers that went from 3 in the afternoon till 10 at night, and then dessert was served after. And they were the most generous, kind-hearted people I can think of. And it wasn't until my dad was 20 or so that his birth mother came looking for him, which then opened up a whole other can of worms as far as family and lineage goes, and sort of dropped a lot of surprises that way. And it turns out that my dad's mother, biological mother, had given up my father for adoption and another boy for adoption a year prior, who also grew up in an Italian household about 20 miles from my parents. They probably had mutual friends and had met once or twice because they grew up in a music scene, but hadn't ever known that they were biological brothers. Mm-hmm. And that, topped with their own families and, first wives and second wives, that is my father's biological mother and his biological father, their respective families, added a whole layer of family intrigue to my story that I had never known existed. I learned that my dad's father, biological father side, they hail from Germany, England, Ireland. There's now some dispute about whether they were actually in Germany or whether they were in Poland. But either way, had come over at the turn of the century, in that first wave of immigration, and had worked as bakers, and were actually successful bakers in Brooklyn up until the Depression. And I learned a kind of funny anecdote that what would have been my great-grandfather was so generous with respect to his bakery that I've been told it's indeterminate whether they went out of business because he was too generous or whether the Depression had hit them, which I thought was funny. Like I thought that there's like a short story in there, like a baker in Brooklyn goes out of business not because of the biggest depression in U.S. history, but because he gives away too much product. Mm-hmm. So maybe one day I'll write that. My mother is Jewish in ethnicity and in heritage, and her family we can trace back all the way through the 1700s in what is now Ukraine, but what was part of Russia at the time. And this was a recent discovery of mine. I knew about a giant book that exists in the possession of some of my relatives, with hundreds of pages of family tree and family stories, etc. But I also learned that there's an author who had written a book about her grandmother or her great grandmother, who's now I can't figure out the exact lineage, but who is a cousin of mine, and tracing their escape from Russia and the pogroms at the time to coming to the U.S. And there were a lot of interesting stories there. I just learned that my great-grandmother had come to the U.S. when she was 3, escaping her mother, so my great-great-grandmother, had brought her and had snuck her overnight along with hundreds of other Russians at the time, Jewish Russians at the time, under the cover of night to try to get a boat out of the area and out of the the unrest that had been caused by the Bolshevik Revolution. And there was a time in that hour my great-grandmother was crying so much that her mother had to make a decision whether to try to stifle the crying or whether to throw her off a bridge. And I can't imagine, this Sophie's Choice-esque moment that must have existed, whether to kill your baby to perhaps save hundreds of other lives, or not to, right? And risk everyone dying. Thankfully, she did not kill the baby. But these are the kinds of stories that I'm now learning, right? The amount of just disastrous emotional turmoil that one goes through, and that you see today in many areas of the world, these kind of crisis points that people have to make. And through learning about these moments, I'm thankful for these stories, right? These stories teach us amazing lessons about humanity. So your interest in ancestry has gotten me interested in ancestry, and now my newest pursuit is to try and really look at some of these amazing family trees that exist and try to work my way through them and understand them, and perhaps reach out to people who are still alive and can tell some of these stories in a much richer way than I could ever imagine.
And how did your parents meet?
They eventually ended up in Lawrence, right? My dad was born there. My mom's mom, after her parents got divorced, my mom's mom had moved them to Nassau County, to the neighboring town called Cedarhurst. And so my parents met in high school. They are high school sweethearts. They're still together, which is remarkable. And my dad was in a band at the time and played music through most of his 20s and early 30s. And my mom was a fan of the music, and they had met in, I think, around probably 9th or 10th grade. And there are probably lots of stories that they could tell that I don't know about, but I just know that they were fellow sort of offbeat, quirky, like indie rock people before there was indie rock.
Yeah.
Post beatniks, I guess you'd call it.
And what did they end up doing for a living?
They stayed in the area. They had built careers there that were sort of dependent on being local. So my dad took over what was originally my grandfather's landscaping business, and my father's a landscaper, and then graduated, I guess, into doing irrigation. So that's what he currently does. He runs an irrigation business, and at the time, most of his business was in Nassau County and centrally located to the 5 towns, right? So they had built a life there around friends, around some family that was still there, and then also just this network, right? The network for their business. Similarly, my mom, she's still a photographer, but at the time, she had been interested in portraiture. So she would take families' portraits on the beach in this very like old-fashioned, almost unposed way, and she would shoot in black and white and sepia, and sometimes like hand color with oils. It was really beautiful. It was almost like this mix between like, fine art and candid photography. It was bizarre and beautiful. And because Lawrence is located near Atlantic Beach and Long Beach, a lot of her clients, her families would be from there, and she would use the kind of existing nature in that area, or whatever nature did exist. There was not much of it in that area to make a business. And my mom has since pivoted, ever since moving here to the North Fork about 20 years ago. She's since pivoted to journalism. So she works for Newsday and freelances for a lot of different magazines and newspapers. She does some, I guess, fine art photography and landscape photography on the side. My dad still runs an irrigation business, although most of his business is now stretched across Long Island.
Mm. And then, so for you coming into the picture, how was it for you growing up as a child in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very different place now than it was when I was growing up, and certainly when my parents were growing up. Now the Five Towns is mostly Hasidic Orthodox Jewish. A lot of that that culture and religion has spread out from Brooklyn and parts of Queens, and has a lot of people from those areas were moving out to Long Island. So when I was coming of age, it was kind of split between the, let's call it more like endemic populations that were there. So that would be Jewish, but secular Jewish, Irish, Italian, Black, Hispanic, Puerto Rican, and to now where it is, I don't have a percentage, but it's overwhelmingly Hasidic Orthodox. So I would describe a lot of my growing up there as informed by a variety of different cultures and races and ethnicities. Most of my friends were different, right? Like, as I said, different races, different ethnicities, different religions. I had, Orthodox Jewish friends that I knew from school lived in Cedarhurst, and I had secular Jewish friends in Atlantic Beach, and I had Black friends in Inwood, and Spanish friends in Woodmere, and it was a really great place to grow up because you weren't judged on that basis. I mean, kids can be kids, and kids can be cruel, right? And sometimes the easiest thing to do as a kid is to acknowledge the first thing you see, and that's sometimes people's color of their skin or yarmulke, right? To identify those things and to separate them by those identities. But I think that was just an immaturity thing. I think really what it came down to was, were you cool or were you not cool, right? And in a way, the only way we tested that was the formation of these large groups and large swaths of different people, and everyone seemed to hang out with each other. And if you weren't cool, then you just weren't cool. But sports and clubs and all of those things that big schools offer and big communities offer, they were really available to everyone. And most of my childhood was spent playing sports. So I was always interested in writing. I always had a journal from a very young age. I think I remember first writing stuff in a journal at second or third grade. But all of those writing experiences and interests in acting and the arts and music, they were almost softened by sports and by my fascination and just exposure to these big club sports in which you had to try out for everything, and there were extracurricular clubs devoted to them. And when I wasn't playing basketball in school, I was on AAU travel teams, and I went to running camp and this crazy baseball camp in the summers, right? So a lot of the friendships I made were on the basis of how well you played sports. And at a certain point, I realized that I was probably, although it formed like my competitive nature and this like desire to prove sometimes the impossible is what I called it, is like at some point I realized that I was much more interested in art. And that's where almost that second childhood of mine came in when I moved to Southold. Like Southold and North Fork like catered and made it possible to explore art in ways that I couldn't do in Lawrence. or I wasn't ready to do in Lawrence.
But how was your school experience in Lawrence? What were you mentioned sports, but how was the environment in Lawrence, and maybe what were you interested in then?
The school experience was great. We had so many opportunities to do academic related things, right? There were triple the amount of AP classes that were available in the North Fork. There were triple amount the clubs. There were triple amount the teachers available. I was always interested in the arts, and I was in the jazz band as a trombonist there, and that was something I'd kept through my entire schooling. I was a photographer in Lawrence for the local or the school paper, right? Eventually I would learn that I loved writing a lot more than photography, and I wasn't any good at photography, but I was always able to do some of those things and was pushed in those directions. And I think the difference between the two, it's funny, I really didn't think of it this way until now, is the difference is that in Lawrence, it was just more competitive. You were competing against more people. It was harder to form relationships with the art itself, and you were sort of doing it for a check mark on your resume, right? There was a bigger focus on where you're going to go to college, what you're going to do. A lot of those, a big percentage, at least when I was growing up, of the graduating class went into Ivy Leagues. I mean, a big percentage, or very competitive schools. So there was a lot of emphasis on that, and I was a good student, but I was less interested in being a good student as I was interested in being a good writer. And I think the two are completely separate. So conversely, in Southold, because there were fewer people, you were really able to engage on a personal level with the people in those clubs and with the mentors and the teachers that ran them. Mm-hmm. So I remember being one of the editors of the high school paper, and it was like, it felt at the time, I know this probably sounds maybe a little nostalgic or wistful, but it felt like we were our own newsroom. Like, we would just go there for fun. We would check out of some classes early on, or the first thing we would do after school ended is just like run to Mr. Stahl's office and get on our stations, and there would be donuts passed around and coffee, and later we would stay till 7 or 8, 9 at night, and there would be pizza, and we would just talk about stuff. And we're at one point we're working on a story, we're passing it around, we're making edits, and we're figuring out the layout and what's going to be at the front of the paper versus where the feature is going to go. And the next moment we're talking about like a new band that just came out and their debut album, right? Or some stupid antics that happened in school that day. Like, it just became this wild place where nothing was off limits and everyone was encouraged to do whatever they wanted, to be whoever they wanted to be. I remember I wrote a 5,000 word essay on ultimate frisbee, which eventually cut down to 1,000 words or 800 words, right? But like, no one should ever write 5,000 words on ultimate frisbee, and yet they were like, you're a good writer, go for it. Like, you want to write 5,000 words on ultimate frisbee, be my guest. Mm-hmm. And that was the kind of place it like invited all of these eccentric behaviors, let's put it that way.
But why did your parents decide to move out to Southold?
They had a best friend here who has now since moved back. He lived in Southold with his family, and my parents would go visit him, and to them, being in Lawrence, which was sort of like the armpit of JFK Airport, right on the Queens border, and boisterous and loud, and something they had always been used to, coming out to quote unquote the country on the North Fork was a was a welcome change. And you have to imagine when they started coming out in probably the 90s, late 90s, it was an entirely different world. Like, looked nothing like it does now. You know, I mean...
What did you think of it when you first came out?
I thought the same thing. I thought, you know, and now when I moved, this was almost 20 years ago, I thought that same thing they were probably thinking, right? And every generation has that viewpoint of like, you know, it's always changing. It's always changing when it's not your perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Or when it's your perspective. And I thought the same thing. It was like, this is their farm stand. What are farm stands, right? And there's wine. I didn't know what wineries were. To be surrounded by the sea, like I was surrounded by the ocean, but the ocean is way different than the bay and the Long Island Sound. And to see these coves and inlets and the way the geography of the land dipped into the geography of the sea, right? And the puzzle pieces those formed, like, it was just wild to me. Spaces between houses, I didn't know what that was. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, my parents had settled, or the house they bought had like, they always said it's almost an acre. And I was like, what's an acre? Like, I didn't know what any of that was. I just thought you had a house and like there's a piece of property. I didn't even call it property. People out here called it property. Like, you know, oh, we have that property next to Sound Beach and blah blah. And you're like, what? What's property? And I think this is like a joke, and people probably mean it facetiously, but when I moved, people would talk about the city as if it was like, they would talk about Riverhead as a city. Mm-hmm. Like, I knew the city as New York City. And, you know, and similarly, like, I was a half hour from New York City on a train in Lawrence, and they were half an hour from Riverhead in a car. And so their exposure to those things was different than mine. And so it was exciting. It was, you know, people have asked me, like, did it shock you to do that, to go from a huge school to a small one and to a very insular place? And I actually was really excited by it. I don't know why. It's something I can't really answer, but I know that when my parents were making the move, there wasn't this frustration or disappointment or anger that I should have experienced, and that one of my sisters did. You know, my sister was in middle school at the time. I have 3 sisters and a brother, but the next eldest was in middle school, and I think she probably had a lot of ill will toward my family at the time, because, you know, you uproot a young woman, right, who's like 11, 12, 13, just coming into her own in middle school, and you say, like, you're going somewhere else. It's really hard. And I think I knew it was going to be a little hard, but I was excited by that challenge at the time.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a bit in school out here with writing but were you interested in writing and reading before you came out here? And I was going to ask you if you had a favorite book as a child.
I was interested in it. I probably did a lot more fantasizing about writing than I did actual writing when I was at Lawrence. I had written a couple pieces for... That's not entirely true that I wasn't writing. I think I was always writing some poems, bad poems at the time, and maybe some, you know, crappy prose pieces, and maybe sending them to literary journals in school and the newspaper and etc. But I did more daydreaming, right? I was really obsessed with pictures of writers, like what Jack Kerouac looked like on the cover of Visions of Deleuze, or the Dharma Bums, like what his photo on the back cover of the Dharma Bums looked like. And I remember reading Carson McCullers' The Heart is a Lonely Hunter when I was around that age, around maybe 11, 12, 13. and being obsessed with that stark photo of Carson McCullers, and almost like wanting to be a writer because I wanted like a cool portrait taken. It sounds crazy, but like that's kind of what I was interested in. And
like you saw those writer photos with Burroughs or the other ones, and they had a cigarette, or some of them did, but it was a cool
I started smoking because of writers smoking. It was a terrible idea, and I've since quit, thank goodness. But for sure, like I remember, this is a whole nother, dovetail into a whole nother conversation here, but I remember smoking as a way to try and write, or smoking after I've written something great, like to the point where I would never actually just write that much, because I would like write an amazing, or what I thought was an amazing paragraph, and then be like, oh, I need to go smoke. And then as I'm smoking, another idea hits, and I would like go inside and like, oh, okay, like, yeah, that's a great line. All right, now I need to smoke again. Like, it's like, it was just and I realized it was actually nothing to do with a fascination with writers as it did with just anxiety, right? I was trying to like quell something that was in my head and trying to do something with my hands. And I've since learned way more productive tactics for handling anxiety, including, sitting with writing for more than 3 seconds at a time. But yeah, I think early on I was reading a lot of stuff that my dad was probably giving me. I mean, aside from early books you read in school, like Goosebumps and Boxcar Children, and I think Lois Lowry books and Louis Sachar, and like enter big name children's book author here, I think I was reading or really fascinated with a lot of the books my dad had read, and was probably maybe a little too adult for me. Maybe I didn't understand them all, but I really love them. So, I read Stephen King for the first time when I was in, I don't know, 3rd or 4th grade. And I remember he got me this book, Storm of the Century, which wasn't a novel. It was just it was a screenplay. I think he had written the screenplay, maybe with someone else. It was a made-for-TV movie. I remember the movie being somewhat okay. In retrospect, it was probably awful. Like, if I'm being honest, it was probably a terrible movie. But really, again, just loving the cover, right? I still remember the gloss on that cover, like the gloss that the type had, and looking at a screenplay, which I'd never seen before, and trying to interpret that. Like, how does one read this, right? How does one read a screenplay when you're not looking at the movie? And trying to immerse myself in a lot of different genres and formats as best I could, and not on purpose, but just because I was surrounded by them, So there was a book of Yeats poems, and I didn't really know anything about poetry, but Yeats was someone I could maybe understand, because some of them were written in almost like nursery sing-song-y rhymey patterns, right? Didn't understand the Irish references, didn't understand the Celtic stuff, didn't understand the religious stuff, but could, at the heart, get into the musicality of it. And that, for me, was the most important part of being a reader, is just being enthralled by words. To this day, I could care less about understanding every line. I think that's futile, and it would take, I've said this, like, there are people who are going to be studying Ulysses for the end of time and still not make any sense of it, or make sense of their own way, which will then vastly contrast every other scholar and how they've made sense of it, right?
Yes.
And if you can spend entire life on one work, then what does that say about like the vast catalog of books throughout history, right? Like, you don't stand a chance. So rather than try to understand it all or figure it out, I just gravitate to what is interesting me at that time, and perhaps it's something completely random. I've spent time in the library just looking at like field manuals, like books on trees, and putting together like electrical wiring systems, not because I will ever understand it, but just because something called out to me that day.
Mm-hmm. And coming out of high school, you mentioned you went to Temple,
Mm-hmm.
but did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
I did. I went to Temple because I got a journalism scholarship, and I am proud to say a nifty, like, big one at that. And that was the that was the motivating factor. I didn't grow up with money. My parents, always prize the idea of hard work, and they do to this day. But the motivating factor for me was like, wow, Temple gave you a bunch of money to go study journalism, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a journalist who worked for, at the time, the Detroit Free Press. I had this fascination with the Detroit Free Press for some reason, and I think it kind of makes sense. I went to Temple, which is a really gritty city. I was interested in Detroit. I think the two, like the grittiness of a city combined with the local journalism aspect, was something I still aspire to. I wish I had that determination and that fastidiousness to have just done it, because it is a lifetime of suck. Like, it is some of the hardest thing you can ever do, and probably the most rewarding. But that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a journalist, and if I wasn't going to be a journalist, then I was going to write for film and be a film critic, or write screenplays. So at the time, publishing, which I eventually went into, fiction writing, poetry, and ghostwriting, which is my career, my thing that makes me money, none of those were on the table. They were aside from ghostwriting, poetry, fiction, and publishing were interests of mine, but they weren't ever something I would have considered. So at that point, graduating Southold, it was like, and I would say every teacher I had would attest to this. Like, they were like, "Oh yeah, Matt's going to go to journalism school and he's going to write for the New York Times." Like, that was all I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. But you eventually got involved with the publishing world and became an editor.
I did
in the publishing world. But how did that come about?
Yeah, it came about randomly, which I think is how some of the best things happen. One half of that was there was another global economic crisis in 2008, in which, personally, I could see people I knew were struggling, right? Like that was the first time. I mean, it was a huge deal at the time. But for the first time, I could see how a financial meltdown that happened like it did in 2008 could really affect people. And I saw people I knew from here who were struggling, right? Parents, friends, my parents themselves. And at the same time, magazines, newspapers, the things I wanted to do were shuttering. They were just closing shop or laying off sometimes 70% of staff. Like, it was, overnight.
Yeah.
And, at the time, it didn't even seem like there were many magazines left. And now, compared with now, there's probably a lot more than now, right? Like, an average person can count like maybe 5 magazines on their hands or something, right? That time, maybe there was like 12, or felt like there were 12. I'm sure there were more. So it was fear. It was fear that, I would graduate, and even if I had a stellar resume, and I say resume because grades didn't really matter. Like, with what I wanted to do, like, I could have dropped out as long as I had clips, right? If someone was like, "Hey, you're going to write for the Philadelphia Inquirer throughout college, and you're going to have a piece a week," right? At the end of 4 years, I'd have a lot of pieces, and that's my resume. That's my schooling. So grades didn't really matter to me. It was like getting in the best position possible to get as many clips as possible. And it was fear that made me withdraw from that. Like, I was thinking, well, even if I have all the clips and the best clips possible, there's still no guarantee that I'm going to get hired. It seemed like there was like very few spots for the amount of kids pursuing journalism in my lecture class, right? Mm-hmm. There's hundreds of those kids, and they were probably just as talented, if not more talented than I. And so I decided maybe I needed to pivot or needed to think about something else. And luckily, I had my parents' next door neighbor in Southold was the CEO of Penguin Books. And he was like, you should apply to Penguin for an internship. And at the time, I think I was 19. I don't even think I was 20 yet. I was 19. I was a sophomore in college. I was going into my junior year, and I applied for a summer internship. And lo and behold, I got it. And I say that winkingly because I know he got me in. So like, there's no way I would have gotten it myself. I mean, again, I did have clips and I did have a good resume, but publishing at the time, it, almost as competitive as it is now, but very few internship spots that you're competing against from with people who just graduated, with people with degrees who want to go into publishing. So the fact that I got one, I'm like, I'm still just so grateful to his kindness. And I took that internship and was working at Penguin, which is on Hudson and Houston Street in the West Village, in this almost industrial side of where the West Village kind of goes into Canal Street and eventually Chinatown, and which just, that'll be like a podcast in itself, which I won't bore you with, but just a really great, cool, magical time in my life to be 19 in the city and dressing in like an oversized work clothes or like dress clothes and showing up to Penguin Books for the first day and seeing my neighbor, who is a CEO, come in to greet the interns, and just like these weird worlds coming together for the first time. I liked that experience so much. I worked with this woman, Anna Sternoff, who's since left publishing, but she was a really influential part of my career at that time, and she had allowed me to do a lot of things that I didn't think 19-year-olds were allowed to do in a publishing office, right? Like handle people's books. Like, didn't know how to do that, but she guided me, and she taught me the ropes, and she allowed me to make mistakes, and that taught me a lot. So I rolled that internship into 2 subsequent internships at Penguin, and then eventually a literary agency. So by the time I graduated college, I had 4 internships in publishing and had made a lot of contacts, and that eventually allowed me to get a job coming out of college.
Well, how long were you at Penguin?
2.5 years, 3 internships. So, I guess that would be 3 semesters worth. 2 of them were summer internships. 1 was a fall internship. After 2 years at Temple, I transferred to Brooklyn College because I knew I wanted to go in publishing at the time. So I wanted to be closer to the city, which is where publishing is. 99% of it's in New York City. And I think my last internship at Penguin, I had taken a marketing and publicity internship for a conservative and business imprint that is still around. And I learned that I hate marketing and publicity. I am not good at it. It's funny now, like promoting or needing to promote my book, that I'm like doing some of these opportunities, like talking about myself or talking about my book, and I find it very unrelaxing to do. I'd much rather talk about other people's books. So, which I guess is what marketers and publicists do. But in essence, I like the hands-on working with words approach rather than let's work on the business side, right? Like let's work on the public-facing consumer side of it. But that experience taught me a lot. It taught me what I didn't like, or that I didn't like as much. And I think the experiences, like those experiences, are equally valuable as the ones you do like, right? Just doing some things you're not used to and that make you uncomfortable.
And after you did the internship there and finished college, did you Did you go into ghostwriting then, or were you still working at another publisher?
I got hired at Penguin Books by this guy, Phil Budnick, he's still a great friend and great mentor to me. And Phil was a sales guy that had come over and decided he wanted to make a little change. And so he left the sales division of Penguin to then be the editorial director of this imprint called Plume. And Plume was a paperback original imprint. So they published paperback fiction and nonfiction as their first edition. And they also did reprints of other imprints, hardcovers. So, and they also had an extensive backlist. Really well-known authors through the ages. You know, August Wilson was one of them, the famous playwright. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we'd go into reprint meetings, and these are meetings where the sales and production team and the publisher would try to account for how many of a certain book to reprint, right, based on the demand in the marketplace. And they'd be like, we're going to reprint 5,000 August Wilson books. I'm like, who's reading what? Like, who's reading August Wilson? And like, of course, he's famous, but like these are books that are 40 years old, right? And then you realize, like, wow, 1,000 of those are going to this university alone, and 1,000 of these are going to a library. And it was it's a really, really cool experience of seeing how books get out there in the world, and working with a guy who was on the sales team who is now taking over editorial duties and marrying that sales purview with editorial taste. And as a young editor, as his assistant, who wasn't even an editor at the time, like, publishing is this long apprenticeship where you work under someone, or sometimes 3 or 4 people, and you answer their phones, and you respond to their emails, and you make their calendars, and you schedule their calls, and you sit in their meetings, and you take notes, and sometimes you offer an opinion, but not too strong an opinion. But Phil is the guy that, like, oh, you can, like, what do you think? Do you like this? Read this with me. Do you want to edit this with me? He and I acquired a book, like, maybe 7 or 8 months into my working there. And he was like, I want you to edit this with me. And I was like, are you sure? I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I think publishing is a unique job in that it caters to that apprenticeship experience, right? A lot of industries have that model. And I think it's an important one. But I think the other one of, like, diving head first and maybe hitting the concrete at the bottom is also important, is making mistakes, is learning what you like, learning what you don't like, learning what you're good at, and learning what you're bad at. And Phil was, like, really amenable to all that. So I worked with him for a few years. Eventually he left went back to sales. Another imprint assumed duties of my imprint. So I was working with a bunch of different people over several months, and after 3.5 years there, so now I'm about 25, 26, I think I'm still 25, I got an offer from an editorial director at HarperCollins who wanted me to come in as an associate editor and do nonfiction. She and I had been talking about it for a little bit. She remembered me from my intern days, actually. I never worked with her directly, but she remembered me, which again says a lot about just being in the same room as people. And she brought me in to do nonfiction. And I worked for her for, I guess, 7 years, almost 7 years. And it was some of the most exciting and infuriating and just illuminating periods of my life. And that's where I really learned to be an editor, under her. She taught me everything. Phil taught me what to look for and how to take chances. And I think Carrie taught me how to edit and how to talk to authors. And that was the other part of the job, right? Is like, you can't be an editor in your own head. You're an editor with somebody. It's a collaborative process. And it's sometimes the most intense process you've ever been a part of, because you're giving feedback on someone's, we use this term playfully, but on someone's baby, right? This is something they've grown and have fostered for years, and sometimes a decade, right? And you need to develop language and empathy with which to speak to them. Otherwise, the relationship crumbles. So Carrie was so instrumental in that. And she also, because it was a nonfiction imprint, that's where I learned the nonfiction way. At the time, before that, I was thinking I was going to be a fiction editor. Everyone wants to be a fiction editor, right? Like, everyone wants to discover the next Joyce Carol Oates or Don DeLillo or, Colson Whitehead, right? Like, there's this dream of fiction editors are cool. I mean, like, they're cool. Fiction writers are cool. Like, they win Nobel Prizes and people know their names and their books are shared with friends. And, like, yes, that stretches in nonfiction, but there's just, like, this clout that fiction has. And I think a lot of editors go into the business wanting to be fiction editors, and as did I. And then eventually I learned that I actually like editing nonfiction way more than I like fiction. Fiction, the kind of fiction I love to read and the kind of fiction I love to write, I would not be a good editor for. I'm too maybe cerebral. I'm too interested in the idea of fiction as exercise than I am in sellability. And I'm much more interested in the idea of sellability for nonfiction than I am for fiction. And maybe it's because it's communicating information, right? It's teaching you something. And to teach you something, it has to be organized in a more coherent method. Whereas fiction, I feel like if you're an author and you want to take me parachuting off the edge of a cliff and then land on a dolphin's back and, we'll ride a wave with a school of turtles and then eventually end up in a wormhole, like, let's do it. Like, if I can trust you can get me there, I'll go there, right? And I think that's why I would probably never be a good fiction editor, is like, I would allow the writer to be like, oh yeah, there needs to be a wormhole in the middle of the ocean, right?
But with this time in publishing and your kind of expectations for it, were there any things that you noticed, or even say, did you see some stuff going on in terms of changes in how people were reading and with audio books? Was that something that was discussed in publishing at that time, and some of the changes that you might have seen that were happening? Though, if we look at today, it's still going strong in some ways, and I know there's some license issues, or the price of an audiobook might almost be the same as a physical copy in some way.
They are. I think a lot of them, they're close. They're the same, if not very close. So I think, to answer your question, those are just technological advancements, right? That are always going to persist, right? In 20 years, there's going to be something new, and audio is going to, maybe it's like you're not just reading the audio, now you're, Mike Tyson is reading it in your room with you, right? Like, whatever.
You can put the AI to do a different...
Like, it's definitely going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So then how do you price that? Is that different than the regular audiobook, or is it part of one package? How do you license that? If you're a library, how do you license an audiobook? These are all the questions they're contending with. And when I was coming into publishing, it was ebooks, right? And ebooks was the big bad wolf that is going to knock down everything, right? It's going to destroy everything. It's going to cannibalize everything. So lo and behold, it didn't. It plateaued, right? There were measures saying that in 2 years, the ebook market is going to be 80% of the book market. And it sort of plateaued at 30%. 30% in just a couple years, change is huge. It's momentous. But once that started to plateau and people can figure out a format with how to engage with it, it's not that scary. And now it's gone down again, right? And audiobooks are peaking. And for good reason, right? Podcasts are huge. People are always on the go. They're doing a million things. Personally, I love physical books, but I don't begrudge any reading experience. If you're reading and you find that audiobook is the best way for you to read or get information, then great. Same thing with an ebook. Same thing with whatever format is going to be decided next. And yeah, so those conversations happened, and you or me as an editor had to be aware of them. But it didn't really change the kinds of books that I looked for and that I wanted to acquire, right? So part of being an editor is you acquire books. You get pitches from literary agents who represent authors, and they write proposals, or they give you synopses, or they send sample chapters, and you meet with them, and your mission is to be wowed by it. You want to say yes to something, right? But more often than not, you're going to say no. So it's looking for the things that make you scream yes, right? Like you're conditioned to say no, so you need to find those books that are like, I'm going to tell you why I want to edit this book. And it doesn't happen, right? Like all the time. I think when I was an editor, I would get 400 submissions a year, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. And I would say, quote unquote, yes to 12 of those, maybe 15 on a good year.
Wow.
I don't have a calculator out, but those are really paltry odds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean another editor can't say yes, but this is the kind of market that you're looking at as an editor and as a writer, right? It's really scary. And so what I believe in is, regardless of whether that book is in podcast form or audiobook form or ebook form, or is delivered orally on soapboxes around the country, right? Like maybe that will happen. Maybe we'll do like an old school, like Abraham Lincoln way of delivering books. But I just believe that the format is a delivery device for the author and for the book. And that book, I don't care where it ends up, it's just got to be good. And that I think most editors would agree with that, right? Like your reason for saying yes is the book. It's not the method.
Mm-hmm. And were you looking for any specific topics within the nonfiction at the time, or did they put you in a certain area of the nonfiction department?
They did. I'm not casting any blame here, because I am a guy who is interested in sports and military and all those things. But the amount of times I heard publishers, editorial directors, agents say to me, "You're a guy, like you must be interested in sports and military and business." And I'm like, yeah, and I write poetry and like watch weird French films. Like I don't, sure, I am interested. I'm a huge sports fan, but that doesn't belie like all the other things I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do get pigeonholed. Like I would edit sports books, I would edit military books. And I'm saying those not because I believe they're male driven. I just believe there's the context around them, right? There's this interpretation that the public has that those are male things, and these things over here are female, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be pigeonholed a little. Like I remember I did Ray Allen, the Hall of Fame basketball player. I did his book, and after I did that book, I think I got like 50 sports submissions in like 3 months. Like it was like, and there's no way I'm doing 50 of any kind of book in any genre in the span of a few months, right? Like what I think I love so much about nonfiction is that I could do a panoply of different genres. Like 1 month I could be editing a narrative book about making something up, a space race. And the second I can be doing a CEO's, lessons to like young entrepreneurs. And the third month I could be doing a chef's memoir, right? Like there were very few books in the same year that I were doing that were the same as another. And I think that's the stuff I was looking for, is the chance for whatever genre it is to surprise me, right? Like if I had done that genre the previous year, like what is this book doing that is different and surprising than the last book I did? And obviously, there's nothing really new under the sun. Everything has sort of been said and told, and it's just the way in which it's said and told, and the varying degrees of difference, but those degrees matter a lot. And that's what those meetings are for, right? Like the wow meetings I talked about, when writers and their agents used to come into the offices. Now a lot of it's done through Zoom, and it doesn't have the same effect. Like it's really hard to get a room of 12 people on Zoom excited. Like there's just this energy that's zapped. But we would have these meetings in the publishing house, and like you're sitting on these slightly uncomfortable couches, and everyone's slightly over caffeinated and slightly not over nice, and but somewhere in the meeting this synergy would happen, and you're laughing and it feels like you've known them forever. And again, maybe some people are charming, sure, but like there's also this idea that personality match with that book's content, match with how they're pitching and describing their book to you, match with the way in which you can see your professional relationship working together. There's that magic that happens, and that's the stuff that makes you say yes, right? And I want to work with this person. So I've done a ton of genres. It's probably easier to say what I haven't done, but I've worked on narrative books and pop culture books in the film and TV and music space, and celebrity memoirs and business books and self-help books, and it really has run the gamut.
And then, so while you were there, had you been writing at all a bit, or working on your own projects at that time? And if you could say when the ghostwriting started.
Yeah, I was always writing my own stuff, which was, I'm not going to say it was a second full-time job, but it felt like close to it sometimes, because I was writing for different publications, whether it was journalism or submitting to different publications in the form of fiction and poetry. So there's always something I was working on. Any given week, month, I was working on something, sometimes multiple projects at the same time, including my novel. So my first novel was started when I was 25, when I first came over to HarperCollins. My poetry book, I don't want to even call it a book at that point, but what became my poetry book was starting to be written then. And I was also running a lot of reading series and doing a lot of readings, and I was part of this collective in the city that paired writers with musicians. So we would play at these different venues, and that was like most of my evenings. It was like going to readings and going to these literary events, and on mornings and nights and lunches, when I had some free time, is writing and submitting. So that was always a staple, and it continues to be a staple, because now with the ghostwriting hat I wear, that's my full-time job, just like editing was. So that is my 9 to 5, even though there's really not 9 to 5. It's like 7 to 8 most days, right? It's like, or whenever, I've had clients who are like, and they're on LA time, it's 11 p.m. my time. They're like, hey, do you have a few minutes to talk? And I'm like, yeah, like, right? Like, can I say no? All right, fine, let's talk. So that's my full-time job. And I transitioned. I left HarperCollins in 2022. So I'll be coming, April will be my 2-year anniversary of doing ghostwriting. It is April. So later this month will be about, I guess, my relative 2-year anniversary since starting ghostwriting. And that is something I've thought about just over the years. I've seen other people make the transition from publishing to being their own business. And it really came down to a lifestyle choice for me. I wasn't in love with the city anymore. I wasn't in love with the corporate structure of publishing. I wasn't in love with where publishing was heading as an industry that was sort of obsessed with celebrity culture and obsessed with bestseller lists. And I made the determination to strike it out on my own, which has its own challenges, but it also has these beautiful benefits, right? I can work from anywhere. I can work whenever I want. I can take breaks whenever I want. I get to work very directly and very closely with an author who's writing their book, and I get to strip out all the other noise, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. The noise is what makes books happen, right? The noise of publicity and marketing and sales team meetings and subrights and conventions and all those stuff, right? It's important, but don't need to focus on those anymore. Like, I can just focus on the book I'm writing. And it's been going great. It's really busy, and so now it's finding space to also get my own writing in. I'm working on my second novel now. I'm working on a lot of short fiction. I've really put poetry on hold for a moment, and I've been trying to work on as much fiction as I can in my spare time.
So you've also been involved as a journalist separate from being in the publishing world. How did that come about?
That was a means of getting a byline, credits, stuff to put on your resume. But it also taught me how to be a much more thorough, attentive writer, because journalism is in the pursuit of truth, right? Objective truth. Obviously, not every piece you write is there's some subjectivity in a lot of these pieces, but you have to make sure that your facts are correct, that your subjects feel respected, the subjects you're interviewing. You have to make sure that it's passing the tests that an editor has, and a copy editor and a proofreader. And so the more questions I could answer as I started reporting, the better. And that actually, both journalism and editing, they're kind of in the same field in a way, because when I was editing, I was sort of anticipating what those questions that some of my colleagues would have, right, who are proofreaders or fact checkers or copy editors. Like, why did we use this term instead of this term? There's a repetition of this word. There's this concept has been explored in the first chapter. Why are we coming back to it now? And by being able to anticipate those questions, I would eventually anticipate what the readership would maybe ask the book or of the article. And so those two things went hand in hand for a while. And to this day, I don't have a lot of time to do journalism, but I try to do 1 to 3 pieces a year, depending on how that year fans out.
And if you're only doing around 3 pieces a year, how do you decide on what you gravitate to? And do you get to decide more, or is it kind of a balance?
It's mostly me deciding at this point, because I'm going to these newspapers or magazines and pitching my story ideas, as opposed to being on staff, let's say, and being assigned something. So it's also tricky, because what I might pitch may not get accepted or even read for 3 months. At which point the editor might say, oh yeah, now, yeah, we would love to run that story. Let's go, do that story. And now I'm saddled with 15 other projects. And so the timing it's always a mystery. I would say I use the guiding principles of just passion, right? Like if I'm going to pitch something, if I'm going to add something else to my plate that year, it's going to be a story that I really want to do, right? And either a thing that I'm obsessed with and I can't get out of my head, right? Like there's a theme I'm trying to go after, and maybe this story hits that theme, or something that is so relevant and pertains so much to the current environment that it needs to be done, right? Like I can't put it on hold. So one of those stories was like this. I wrote a story for Grammy's website, like the Grammys. They have a website called Grammy.com, or the Recording Academy. And it was about these prisoners on death row who recorded the first album to ever be recorded by prisoners on death row through this organization called Die Jim Crow. And some of these people were amateur musicians. Others had studied over the years of being in prison or had played music before being incarcerated. And that was a story that tied into, I think this was in 2020 or 2021, and it tied into the current discussion at that time around not only just COVID, right? Because these are prisoners who were battling ailments, pre-existing ailments, and now had to combat COVID in prison, but also our issues around social justice and civil rights and police brutality. And these were people who expressed some of those themes and some of those discussion points through music. And that was a thing, well, like, yeah, the album will live on, but this has got to be written now. And that was one of my favorite pieces to write. It was a challenging piece to write, but got a lot out of it.
And separate from that, you've also been working full-time as a ghostwriter. I think you mentioned that earlier on. And you've been doing that even while you've been out here on the North Fork. How is that process of being a ghostwriter? Because you're basically having to work behind the scenes with different people, and how has that been? And could you discuss some of the challenges as well?
It's a job that is unlike any other writing job I've had, because you're functioning as the person's voice, right? As let's call them the author, because they are the author. They're on the book. It's their story. It's their project. I'm simply helping them get that out. So I'm helping them discover their voice on the page, right? Everyone has a voice, a speaking voice, an active voice in conversations, but what does your voice on the page look like? And that's something that I'm helping them discover. At the same time, working as their pseudo therapist, and I don't mean to exaggerate that. I am absolutely not a doctor, and I'm not a therapist, and I have no formal training in that. I just mean that via the many conversations you have with these people over the year, you sort of start to hit on some truths in their story, and maybe lead them to some truths they hadn't thought of, right? And so one of my jobs, and I think the most rewarding part, is just always challenging them to think beyond the page, right? They have a story they want to tell on this page in this chapter, but what is the resonance of that story? What is it communicating to someone reading it for the first time? What is it suggesting? What questions is it trying to answer, right? What truths is it trying to uncover? And I just get to work with the most amazing people in the world. Actors, military personnel, podcasters, psychologists, amateur historians, athletes, like it runs the gamut, right? There's so many different people I get to work with and stories I get to tell. So that's the most amazing part of it. the challenging thing is maybe the idea that you don't always get it right. You're not only just working with your own insecurities as a writer, because every writer has insecurities, but you're working with theirs. So they may tell you something that's really truthful and really heartfelt and really deep, and you're trying to translate it, and then you send it back and they're like, what is this? Sounds nothing like what I thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's being prepared, and that's part of the process. Like you will work through that, and you will, because nobody's going to get it right exactly the first time. So that's part of the process, and that's part of the growing pains. Assuming you can get through it, you'll be fine. If you can't get through it, maybe it's not the right, that person is maybe not the right fit for you. You're not the right fit for them. Mm-hmm. Because it's a personality match at the end of the day. You have to get along. You have to be prepared to be vulnerable and be prepared to be wrong. And, writing in general is just like to be fraught with rejection at all times. And ghostwriting is just another part of it, right? Let's say you write a proposal for someone and you spend 6 months on it, and the agent can't sell it. Then you start to interpret, was that me? Was that my fault? Is it did I write a bad proposal? Probably not. There's a multitude of reasons why a project doesn't sell. But mm-hmm. that's always on your mind, right? Like, it's not just your failure now, it's your author's. Mm-hmm. That's the challenging part.
Mm. In 2020, you wrote a book titled House of Sound, which contains 28 poems. Was that one of your first?
That was my first published book. So, first poetry collection, first book, yeah.
And how did that come about? Because you had been writing poetry before this, but how did you kind of pick these 28 poems, and what kind of inspired you to decide to put it out?
My poet friend Miranda Beeson talks a lot about organization and order, and really just forming a collection, right? Like the idea of how different poems talk to each other and how different poems relate and how they fit in and some don't. I think I didn't set out to write a book. I don't know if a lot of debut poets do. There seems to be this almost unwritten rule that like your debut collection is just a collection of poems you've published over the years. And then as you start to publish more, you start to be a lot more intentional about what that work is doing. So maybe the second book is, I'm going to write a poetry book about fire, which is actually something I'm thinking about right now. About firefighting.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
The idea of risk taking and firefighting and being close to fire, standing too close to fire, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a very distinct theme now. The first collection, it was like, what are the themes I'm kind of looking at? I called it House of Sound because there's this idea of the sound of the lines, the sound of the vowels themselves in the poems, but it also talks a lot about domesticity and family and houses and the sounds that families make occupying a house or not occupying a house, right? The sound of an empty house. And then furthermore, how nature both amplifies or subdues some of those sounds. And so what that poetry collection was looking at is the interplay and the relationship between nature and our occupation within it. And I think it works. There's a couple poems in there that I wish I could stomp on and extinguish, to use the fire analogy, but that's okay. I don't think any person writing anything looks back on their work and says, wow, I 100% nailed it. Mm-hmm. That's the one, Yeah,
there's always, you kind of reanalyze some things later on and Well, I'm not sure about this one, but I mean, I think it's always making that first plunge, because I don't know if you've read your poetry before that or have expressed it in some other ways before releasing it, but it's always interesting getting feedback and seeing the response.
Yeah, I tell people who are picking up that collection for the first time that there's 3 poems in there that I despise, and I go, can you find them?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, then it becomes a fun challenge, because sometime maybe they'll come back and say, oh, I found them. I think I know the ones you're talking about. And then those are the ones I like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, oh my God, I have 6 poems in here that I really hate now, or that I know people. So, but I think it just speaks to the subjective nature of it all, right?
Yeah.
And that poetry collection, I was lucky enough for it. I sent it out and it got accepted, and I worked with a great editor, 2 great editors in putting that together. And, they taught me a lot about how to put it together, right? I didn't, there were instincts I had, but through a lot of their work and line editing and questions about pacing and how the poems, like how maybe one long poem is offset by a smaller poem, right? There are all those kinds of decisions. They taught me a lot about that. And since then I've been really thinking about how those fit together. I'm not working on a new poetry collection. I'm working on new poems, but I'm in the back of my mind, I'm sort of thinking about how they kind of respond and talk to each other.
Mm-hmm. And after that was in 2020, did you publish anything else in between then of your own before coming up to your debut novel, Longitude of Grief?
I published stories in different journals and magazines and websites, short fiction. I don't think I published a poem since 2018, which is weird to say. Now I'm like, I gotta go back, publish a poem somewhere. But
Well, you didn't do anything, because sometimes I ask people if they had any inspiration over the pandemic, or you didn't, or how did you feel creative wise?
I was working on my novel over the pandemic, so yeah. To get back to your question, it like the stuff I was publishing was journalism, short fiction, maybe an essay here or there, and working on my novel. The last poem I think I published was probably in 2018. Then I published the collection, which is monumental, right? But it's, for me, it's not monumental in culture, but for me. And yeah, I think when that collection was published, I almost had to take a big step back and really just start writing again. Because I don't think the two exist on the same plane, writing and publishing. Publishing is like it's like showing up for the game, and writing is the practice every day to get ready for the game. And the practice is, the game's important, but the practice is like what makes you show up well. And so I use that time to both take care of my mental health, I think, right? Like, as everyone did. I think that's what it was. It was like, all right, how can I exist in the world and where it seems really scary right now? There were other stuff to contend with, right? Job shifts, my company managing that, every company managing that, relationship shifts, there was a lot that kept me occupied during that time, which then all figures into the writing. I was laughing with somebody the other day because we're writing a book proposal, and I was talking to the agent and the authors, and we were having this whole discussion about how nobody wants to talk about COVID, right? They were like, please leave it out. Like, no more books about COVID, no more this, no more chapters about COVID. And I tend to agree, but it's every story has its place, right? And even though we've heard it before, it is important to people's kind of gestation and where they ended up after it, and how they got through it. So I think people are sick of COVID stories, but I still think they're important.
Yeah, I think there were a lot coming out right after, say like 2021.
Mm-hmm.
But now that it's been a few more years, let people think about it a little bit more. They've had a little more space from it, so it gives them time to reflect a little bit. And I think it's still important because I'm sure people will start gathering data. Well, all people are already gathering data and analyzing that period in time.
Absolutely. I just don't know if mine is that important, right? Like, I think that's, and maybe there's so many people who say that, right? When you start to scale people's experiences next to each other and compare trauma and compare scars, which I think is actually a really dangerous thing. Like, who's to say that one person's trauma outweighs another person's?
And then it becomes a competition on how can I show that I was more traumatized, and then it gets away from just telling people's experiences, and everyone's going to have a wide range.
Right. So when I look at trauma, I mean, I lost someone close to me, not from COVID, but during that time. So there was that. But when I think about, like, did COVID negatively impact my life, like, as compared to other people? Maybe no, but it did have some impact. And I start to reflect on just like the kind of general well-being that the world existed in, right? Like, living in New York City, there was at 7 o'clock every day, like, there was just, or in Brooklyn, there was like a round of applause for emergency medical help, for nurses and doctors and like their efforts. I was like, that's amazing. Like, why don't we do that more? Right? People collect garbage were being applauded because, they were keeping the streets clean. Why don't we do that more? So we start to think about, and I'm not saying it has to be an applause, right? It has to be a standing ovation, but the little mementos of gratitude that we can show, I think, especially living in a place like New York City at the time where it felt very disastrous at times and overwhelming, you start to look for those little moments, and I think those are important.
And could you describe a little bit, because you're working on your first novel, Longitude of Grief, could you describe how that came about?
I was thinking about this relationship between a boy who's coming of age and an older person in town, and this friendship they sort of form, but a friendship based on almost competition, and one being very wise and one being very inexperienced. I think Stephen King explored it a little in Apt Pupil. There's thousands of stories about, the old wise head and the young naive person, right? There's Great Expectations. Just rewatched that movie actually, and I was thinking about that a little bit, and how those themes in my novel, right, are echoing some of those themes in Dickens' book. And so I had that idea in my head, and I think it was formed by some friendships I had out here that were great. They're not, like, none of them are, in the novel they become toxic, right? And that's what I'm sort of exploring, is like when a relationship that starts off as amicable and helpful starts to become toxic and dovetail and become competitive, and become threatening. So I was just sort of playing around with that idea and writing from the perspective of a boy who is maybe not that much younger than I was at the time. So he was 21, 22, around there. And trying to understand through his lens, like, what is it about this older person that he gravitates toward? Is it his sagaciousness? Is it his worldliness? Is it the opposite of worldliness, being in a place for so long that he knows every back street, but he only knows the back streets in this town, right? He's never been to Rome. But he feels, the young boy feels like he's been to Rome. So I started exploring that, and then having just fun writing these exercises, like these, almost like, I call them like book reports, where the narrator, or the young boy who eventually became Henry, who becomes the narrator in third part, writes these almost book reports of sorts that he's about his lessons with this older guy, Joseph. And through there, I started to think about the other relationships in these people's lives, their love interests, their families, their cousins, the priests, the school teacher, the ambling boyfriend who comes in and out and escapes the cat. That became a favorite character of mine, this guy Jonathan. He's sort of this bumbling small town idiot and wants to run for mayor and doesn't get it, and eventually just settles in, because he's a farm boy, farm man, and he settles into just being a farmer again until he eventually gets to California, and he realizes he's inherited a lot of money, and he starts to come back and almost inherit this bravado of being like a tech guy who's gone to California for 2 weeks, and now he's come back with like these like Patagonia vests and like a hat, and and so that was it. I started to think about the constellation of various characters in this small town, and then the act, or the question for me was, how do I put it together, right? And what is it trying to say? And the book is less plot driven. People will be very disappointed to know there's not a big plot in this book. I'm sorry, guys, if you're going to read The Longitude of Grief, do not expect John Grisham, because you will not get it.
You're kind of just going along with these characters, and not, if you're trying to expect some big plot twist or outcome at the end. I don't know if you would say, in some ways.
Yeah, I can tell in your voice how disappointed you are.
No.
No. But it's like there's moments of, in very big drama, there's moments of extreme hurt and pain, but there's not a typical 3-act structure. And I'm really not interested in those kind of, gotcha moments of plot. And I almost like function. I like the book to function as like this revolving doors of characters, people coming in and out of lives. And that's really the sad and also beautiful truth of our lives, right? We latch onto something for a little bit, and then they walk out the door and something new comes in. Or we hold on to an idea or a person for a long time, but the idea of who they are also changes, and that's what the novel's exploring, those revolving doors of character and motivation and identity.
But do you think it's in some way a coming of age story?
Sure.
And then dealing with different, like you said, that age gap in the friendship with the person. But when you were writing it, did you kind of know what you were thinking the outcome would be, or over time developing, what am I trying to say towards the end?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's all subjective, and then you'll get critics and other people that will put their own opinion on it, and you might be like, I didn't think of it in that regards. But
I would love that. I like that. So that thing I used to be scared of, this idea of like critics putting their own stamp on what it is. And I think that's just awesome. Like, because sometimes it could be so far from the truth, but it's true to them. It's their experience reading the book. And I used to be afraid of negative reviews, and I'm like, I kind of welcome it. I think it's, so if anyone wants to negatively review it, please go ahead. Negative reviews are better than no reviews. Yeah, I think I did know where it was going at some point. I had a conversation with this guy, Robert McKee. Robert McKee is like the foremost inventor, in a way, of the like screenplay structure, of character structure in film. He's in this, if you've seen the movie Adaptation, Robert McKee makes a cameo, and Nicolas Cage's character takes Robert McKee's workshop. And so I had published or reissued some of Robert McKee's books when I was at HarperCollins, and he and I got on the phone once, and he was like, "Are you a writer?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm a writer." And like, I think he was like trying to like do his Robert McKee 3-act structure with my work. And I was like, I don't think I have a structure. I don't think I have an ending. I don't know what. And he asked me to talk it through. And he's most interested in character change, and how character change is a type of plot movement. What is the character going through, right? And how do those, what he goes through, change him or not change him at the end? Even not change is a type of change in a book. So that conversation with him elevated a lot of stuff that I was sort of thinking about. And I almost got his approval, not officially, but I think that conversation allowed me to say, oh, okay, I think I am doing the right thing. I'm doing the right thing for what this book needs. So if you hate the book, it's Robert McKee's fault. Just putting up.
And then also linked with the book, with the way you were describing some of it, is there quite a bit of inspiration from you living on the North Fork and having some of that farm or rural, I don't know, some people don't like when I say rural, out here, or country living.
Yeah, it is rural in a way, right? It's
not as rural as, maybe it's not as rural as it once was to some
Sure.
people, but it's still compared to Western.
Yeah.
Going west.
Yeah, and I think it to answer your question, there's a lot of influence. The town is called Hold'em, which is like a play on Southold. It's this area where farmland meets these interconnected bays and inlets, very similar to the North Fork. Small town. I think in my novel it's probably smaller a town than some of these towns in the North Fork. But there's definitely a lot of echoes, if not sometimes carbon copies of some things that have existed out here. Especially from my childhood. I mean, I remember there was this person who protested the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and would count the number of victims on both sides, right? U.S. soldiers and then Afghan victims. And I remember that, like, he would paint these numbers in this like blood red on the side of the road. And it was also then this protest organization would like come in and like lead a protest in the middle of Southold, of which I was part of in high school, like there's like 20 of us. It wasn't like a big protest, but yeah, you have these various identities competing with each other. And I think there's geographic identities, there's inlets meets farmland meets developments, right? That's factors into the novel. but also in real life, right? Like this is the current conversation. How do we grow the North Fork without necessarily putting, putting hard hats on and putting construction vehicles on the road? Like, what does growth look like? What does an influx of people look like? What does homes look like? So you have that conversation, and then you have the flux of different identities. You have people who, what is the word or phrase out here? Keep it small, or keep it, I don't know, not make the North Fork great again, but like that sort of version, right? Like keep it local. Like, so you have that, and then you have people who are coming in and may not be full-timers. And what are those conversations look like? So the novel is really looking at all of those. While it's not explicitly saying this is what this is about, these characters are kind of, through their coming of age stories, are trying to wrestle with a lot of those ideas.
And then I was curious about just your writing in general. I guess focusing more on your personal writing with your novels than more so with ghostwriting and publishing with in journalism. Your process, do you write every day? People probably ask you a lot about writer's block and just kind of your process. Do you feel like you have to keep writing all the time, and some of the ups and downs that you might see?
It's an exercise. Absolutely. It's, to borrow the analogy from before, it's working out. It's singing, right? If you don't sing for a while, your throat closes. Some singers say. I don't know if they say that, but it sounds right. Look, I have a full-time job. I have other jobs on the side too. I wish I could say I write every single day from 5 to 7 in the morning. It's just not realistic. I do try to write a majority of the week. So if that's 4 days, if that's 5 days, then that's great. Sometimes it depends on what I'm working on. If I'm working on a novel, it's sometimes considering that the novel, like I'm working on a novel now, the novel is a huge, immense undertaking. And to chip away at it, you have to put in those amount of words a day, right? Or a certain amount of words. So my thing was like, can I write 500 to 700 words every time I'm working on a novel? And knowing that after a first draft, half of those words are probably going to be cut. They're going to be rewritten, but you just need to get to and this is a lesson I learned from another novelist, is you just need to get to a point in the novel where it's really hard for yourself to turn back. So if you keep fiddling with a sentence on the first page, like you spend a month just tinkering with sentences on the first page, well, you're still just going to have a first page. But if you have 50 pages, 80, 100, it makes it that much harder to say, well, I'm just going to give up now. Like, you have 100 pages. There's stuff there. Even if you don't realize it, you have the material to work with now, but you can't realize it with one page. And that was a huge lesson. So when I'm working on a novel, it's word count, right? And it's not just to get to a word count. It's like, obviously I'm thinking about ideas that are relevant. Sometimes, to answer the writer block question, there's a part in a novel where maybe I don't want to make a decision because it's a hard decision. Does the character, I'm just using a metaphor, but like, does the character go down that hallway and open the door on the other side? Well, if they do, what do I know? Do I know what's on the other side yet? So I don't want to write that yet if I don't know. It's part of writer's block. Like, that could be a form of writer's block, is not making a decision. Sometimes you just have to make the decision, even if it's wrong, or you later declare it wrong. Other times, just doing exercises like write a story about a door. Like, forget the character, forget the utility of the door in the novel. Just write 300 words about a door.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to just open up these pathways in your mind, and you get out of that writer's block by just exercising, right? It's like the difference between, I'm going to work out and I'm going to work out for an hour. Well, you can't work out for an hour if you don't just do like 5 push-ups first, right? Just do the push-ups. So that's the writer's block thing for me. It's just like, just do the writing. It doesn't have to be the writing that's going to make it into the work. It just has to be writing. So yeah, I think that is my routine is like, I guess, a lack of formal routine, but it's getting in the writing when I can and adhering to a word count. And with poetry, it's just jotting stuff down all the time. Like, I have 3 notebooks in my bag, and I'm either writing a journal entry, or I'm writing inspirational quote I found, or I'm taking notes on something, or I'm writing a new poem. And most of those things don't go anywhere, but they count. In my mind, they count as something.
Mm-hmm. And I think we talked about it a little bit when you were a child, kind of what books you were reading and authors, but I was curious a little bit now. Could you talk a little bit about what authors have inspired you more in your adulthood?
Yeah, absolutely. I try to read as many classics as I can, not to be a complete bore and to discount some of the amazing literature coming out now. But those books that really challenge me in a structural and theoretical way are the books that I love. So for instance, Steinbeck's East of Eden. It's an incredible work, not because, the writing is incredible, but it's incredible what it's trying to do in its scope. I think on a smaller side, Chekhov has that in short fiction form or even play form. He's concerned, or he's obsessed with these smaller characters in these small towns, and either their feuds, their compulsions, their love affairs. So Steinbeck's looking at it from like a very, like almost like the mountain top, and like Chekhov's looking at it from like the valley. Mm-hmm. And I like that kind of interplay. Then they're just the short story writers that inspire me. Short story writers inspire me a lot. David Means is one of them. George Saunders. Ben Lerner. Ben Lerner's like just wacky. Like, none of Ben Lerner's stories should work, and yet they do, because he's unafraid to like go there, right? He wrote a story about a guy who, I think if I'm remembering correctly, the guy is talking about, he's choking at this cafe, and he's choking in front of his kid, and he says, and he's about to die, and this is like his last sort of like remembrances as he's dying, and he talks about, and like the story alone could be great right there, but he talks about like how this would be a better version of dying than dying on a toilet. And then the story goes into like, well, what it would mean die on a toilet. And it's like, it's wacky, amazing, and funny. Jennifer Egan is another one of my favorite writers. Helen Phillips. People who are amazing sentence writers, but are also unafraid to be philosophically inquisitive and to push the boundaries of reality and fantasy. And I don't mean it in a genre way, but almost in a surrealist way.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about some of the classics, because I feel like right now that's an interesting topic going on in terms of there's been somewhat of shifts in terms of what's what people feel that they should read, and maybe getting rid of some of the classics. But what would you say to someone that's like, oh, I gotta read this old classic from this guy or something, and not really acknowledging the historical history of literature and how it's developed and how it's been influenced over time, whether it has been written in a different style from back then. And yeah, I'm curious what you might say to someone that might disregard classics in some ways, and what classics should we look at. And
Yeah, I think it's all based out of fear. And I think if you are afraid of words on a page, then how are you going to operate in real life? Right? These are just words on a page. I'm not saying ideas are real.
mm-hmm.
But the Bible is just words on a page. The Quran is just words on a page. But they have immense power and sway. Of course they do. But they also have immense gifts. And the gifts they give are competing thoughts, competing notions, competing belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So my takeaway is, if you want to be siloed with your own belief system and you're so set on that's the right way, then I don't think you're a free thinker anyway, right? I don't think you're going to grow personally.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say you need your mind changed, but you need to be open to having your mind changed. And that's the power of good literature, is the idea that at any point, even if you don't agree, you can think, and you're open to thinking. You're open to other people's ways of seeing the world. And I can go into the book ban thing, which I think is the most ridiculous thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It just never really made sense to me, because when I think about it from the conservative perspective, which that's primarily who's wants to ban books like 1984 and
mm-hmm.
Toni Morrison, etc. It's like, wait, so you think there should be no government control, right? Like, philosophically, you're against government rule and government control and government, peering down your back and saying what you can or cannot do. So from a political standpoint, that's how you feel. But with books, the government should rule. The government should tell you what to read. It just seems completely contradictory to me.
Mm-hmm.
It comes out of fear. So I think it undermines the amazing, Republican template that someone like Abraham Lincoln would have founded and did found, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to speak about someone who was like unafraid of other ideas, right? And to know he was wrong, or it was going to be perceived as wrong,
mm-hmm.
and still tried to fight for a just cause. Like that's true democracy, and that's true humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's like, I think we think about these things as a binary. It's like you either have to agree with all these books or disagree with all these books. It's like, well, it's neither. You can agree with the book and still find it to be a crappy book, just as you can disagree with the book and still find joy and heart in it, right? And so to get it out of that political sphere and talk about it more as a general reading experience, I get it. Some of these classics are really stodgy and crusty and right, like they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we have to necessarily uphold like Harold Bloom's canon, right? For a while it was like, whatever Harold Bloom and these like critics,
It's Western canon.
yeah, the Western canon. whatever they say is what we should be reading. Like, I don't know. No, I don't think
It's
so.
just one person. I mean, it's one perspective, but I think.
Well, I was gonna say you need, for some of this stuff, you also need a good teacher. And I think there's a marked difference between reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in ninth grade, whenever people read it. I think I read it going into ninth grade, or 10th grade. Difference between reading that text with a teacher who could not be bothered to understand the socio-political, economic discussions of the time in which it was written, and a teacher who does, right? Because let's face it, like, Dostoevsky's not, in my opinion, not even a great prose writer. He's a great writer, but he's not like gonna dazzle you on the sentence level. So what is he talking about, right? And I think if you have a teacher who can really address that, identify it, and then bring it into contextual terms, into modern terms, and say, like, what his character, Raskolnikov, I think, is obsessed with is what this person's obsessed with nowadays. And to think about it like that, and to also have a cross-pollination of ideas. So, like, I learn a lot about literature from podcasts, from movies, from other writers writing about what that main text is, right? So, like, Nabokov is like a great example. Like, I think Nabokov hated Dostoevsky. I'm pretty sure. Wrote a lot of, like, scathing criticism on it. Like, that's interesting to me. Like, you have two of the most heralded writers of all time, and they, like, one hates the other. Like, why? So again, there's that cross-pollination. Like, if you just stick to the text, yeah, Crime and Punishment could probably be boring. But I don't think it's like should be outsourced. It's like, no, we can still read it, but let's read it with a different lens, or let's think about how to implement some other studies around it.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at it from the time it was written, because some things, and that could be with a lot of different books, the wording might come across more offensive back then, but you have to kind of look at it through that time frame in some ways. For some books that, like, say, well, even recently, Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming, that's kind of coming because the Republicans have kind of looked more. I guess you could say the right has looked more at that. Maybe the left has looked more at some of these other things with changing the wording.
Yeah,
within the book.
Also absurd, in my opinion.
Yeah,
like,
I think it's almost insulting to the author and the readers that you can't let them just
100%
read it at that way and not have to, like, censor a book.
It's taking out the personal responsibility and accountability we have, right? It's saying we're dumb. We're too dumb to make informed decisions. Look, I think I was just having this discussion the other day about movies and watching movies with your parents not showing you certain movies when you're too young, and then sort of like saying, okay, now you're old enough to understand, right? But they don't, like, when they show you the movie, I mean, at least in my case, they're not showing me a censored movie. They're not saying, okay, you're old enough to watch The Shining now. However, we took out all the gore, the old woman's breasts. Jack Torrance is not undergoing some psychosis, right? Like, there's no mention of alcoholism. Like, no, I'm seeing all of that. I'm making informed decisions, and I'm learning what my response and my triggers are to that. And I'm not saying that these movies, these books don't trigger people. They do trigger people. But that's the point, is that they're works of art. Art triggers people. You know, when Duchamp decided to put a urinal in a gallery, like, I'm sure that was shocking. And you know what? It's also brilliant.
Yeah. But to change the subject a bit to involved, how did you decide to volunteer for the Southold Fire Department? Is it just fire?
Fire department.
Fire department.
I wanted to be triggered to. No, I in a way, seriously, it was my best friend Ian is he works for the Department of Energy in DC, but he's also a volunteer in Maryland, volunteer fireman in Maryland, and he, over the last many years actually, 5-7 years, he's undergone this like amazing transformation of like mental and physical fortitude. Like he looks healthy and his mind is healthy, and he, like, his hobby now is firefighting. Not in like, oh, I can't wait, there's a fire, but in what firefighting does. What it does well is it teaches you skills. You know, it teaches you mechanics, fire mechanics, chemistry, physics, electricity at times, mechanical engineering. There's so many skills you can learn. And that's even before there's fire, right? It teaches you to work with others. It teaches you to protect each other, and teaches you to be prepared. One thing that I got out of it is, or that I continue to get out of it, is when I look at day to day, what I used to deem as an emergency or deem as a crisis or something that stressed me out, I then compare those to actual fires. You know, firefighters also in most volunteer departments also handle EMS. And so in addition to fire calls, we're handling every emergency responding call that happens in Southold. And, you know, my day of being stuck on a paragraph and not being able to find my way out of a paragraph is nothing compared to someone whose kid is having seizures or whose grandma just had a cardiac arrest, right? And so it puts those things in perspective. And, you know, it's probably been the most humbling thing in my life. I'm coming on my second year now, and it's probably been the most humbling thing I've done in my life. And this is something I hope to continue for the rest of my life, whether it's at Southold or another volunteer department. You know, again, the mental aspect, the physical aspect, and the communal aspect. This idea of like, you actually see your community members, you meet them, right? You say hi to them, and that's something, it's been so rewarding. And it's actually opened up the writing for me in a big way. And so I've been lucky. When I joined Southold, there was, I think about 8 to 10 newer members, many of whom were younger. And because of that, we've had this like amazing training rapport where we show up every Wednesday, sometimes twice a week. We learn new skills. We put ourselves in very unique situations. And those are the humbling parts, right? Like sweating more than you've ever sweat before while learning a new skill. And remembering that like, this is just training, right? But it's the training that like will make you a really good firefighter when those times come. And like, you know, Southold alone, we've had 4 fires this year, and it's April, so that's about a fire a month at this point, and that's unique for this region, right? So another thing to think about is, as more people come out here, as more construction happens, as more development happens, the likelihood that more of these accidents will happen, it goes up. And so that training and being prepared for that is really important.
And I think the calls have been going up for Greenport as well.
Absolutely. And they will spike in the summer. I mean, I don't have stats on that, but I imagine, again, there's more people out, and it's not just fire, it's people in the water, right? Firefighters handle water rescue. A lot of these departments have boats, so the more people go up boating in the summer and unfortunately drinking while doing it, those accidents will continue to happen. And there's an immense pride I have in the fire department. So if anyone is listening and wants to be part of a fire department, I highly recommend it. You know, I think people are like, it would be really hard for volunteer departments to just turn down people. Like, I think if you showed interest in wanting to do something, pending, you know, there are some departments where you have to go to the academy and train, and that's what we did. But I think departments would work with people, and I would think that a lot of younger people who might be struggling, and I can testify to this fact, like, you know, I've struggled with depression and anxiety for many years. Like, you want to talk about like doing something for your mental health, this is far beyond anything I could think of. It is like, you will not think about how sad you are when you are training or in a fire or in a rescue situation. You are just training. You are thinking about survival, and not just your own, but like other people's. And that empathy factor goes a long way. And you know, when my dad got sick this about a month ago, like, I mean, there was a huge community response, and I'm so indebted to that. And a large part of that community response was through the fire department. Like, I knew that my dad was at the hospital. I needed to get, like, someone needed to pick up his van at the hospital in Riverhead. And I just got on a group chat and I said, like, this is what's going on. Could someone help me? And it's like 7 people were like, yeah, I got you. And that's like, again, you know, to remind people that when we're in our heads about whatever is going on in life, and there's a lot of those triggers and reminders, like, that there's people that you have alongside you that are going to be there. And that's, like, again, another huge benefit of the fire department.
And
sorry to make this a fire department podcast.
No. And we discussed a little bit about you living on the North Fork. Obviously, things have changed since you graduated from high school here. And is there anything that sticks out to you that you've really noticed? And I always ask people if they miss anything about the way, or is there something that you don't see as much anymore? And it doesn't have to be in a nostalgic way, but just something that you don't see.
Yeah. I guess the biggest thing I've noticed is the development that's happened. And I'm someone who's very much like, and this is not an economic conversation to me. This is just like an aesthetic conversation. Like, if I go back to the rural thing, like, the North Fork's not rural enough for me. I love, like, I could be in the Adirondacks. I mean, I could be anywhere, but I have a lovely community here, and that's why I'm here, first and foremost. But, like, yeah, I would be in the middle of Montana or the Adirondacks or mountains in New Mexico, right? Like, I love being out there. So at the end of the day, I have to remind myself, like, this is not, you know, Billings, Montana. It's Long Island, right? It's like starts to become an extended suburb of Queens. But I think that development has happened drastically, and I find a lot of it really appalling. That's, again, I'm not saying people who are buying houses are appalling. I'm just speaking from an aesthetic level. Like, what's pretty to look at? Well, housing construction is not pretty to look at. Deforestation is not pretty to look at. You know, mega in quotes, hotels going up in the middle of town aren't pretty to look at. So I brush against a lot of that. Not because I don't think a lot of these people are good people. I think they are. And I think they want anything else that people want is a safe home, is security, is an investment. Those are all great things. But I think from an aesthetic point of view, I see a lot of that change happening very quickly. And I worry that it's going to keep happening at a rate that the infrastructure and the size of this land, which isn't small on the North Fork, is not going to be able to keep up with. So that's maybe more negative than I thought. I don't know. But in some ways it's still very much the same place I left. Like, I don't think people's mentalities have really changed. I think when they say like salt of the earth, like I think Greenport, Southold, like towns I've spent a lot of time in, East Marion, like they have those kinds of people in spades, right? Like these are people who live off hard work and community spirit and simplicity. You know, I think simplicity in a really positive way. I don't mean in like a dim way. Like I actually think simplicity is the most ego suppressing thing you can have. And like that's one way I'd love to live my life, is like, let's strip out all the things that don't matter, right? Like, let's live simply. And maybe that's some of the things that I still see a lot of. Like, I still see that mentality. But I also think that's starting to change. Like, and it's not just out here, it's just in general. Like, you start to add more technological advancements. You start to add more of this pursuit of money and belongings, and like, you can't live simply anymore. So I don't know.
And what, now that you're living out here, and there are some challenges and issues that the area's facing, and resources and other things that our towns dealing with, but what do you hope for the future of the North Fork and Southold Township down the line?
I hope it's a place where people, both who've lived here for a long time and who are coming in, understand the history a little more of Long Island, of this region especially, and of, you know, people whose lands we also took away. You know, I think it's easy to say, you know, again, keep it local and whatever the phrase is that I couldn't locate before. But it really wasn't our land to begin with anyway. So, you know, like, if we're gonna be real about it, like, let's have mutual respect for all kinds of people who come in and who have been here a long time, right? Because that's the story of America too. It's like, we can say, you know, well, let's make America great again, but what was great, right? Like, what greatness are we talking about? What are we referring to? So mutual respect for the land, mutual respect for each other, and I think an ability to keep art alive. And I think that the obsession with progress, and when we call like economic progress and development, it always goes back to like commerce and culture. Like, that culture of commerce is more restaurants, more businesses, more of this, right? More hotels, because hotels bring in more people who can stay overnight that'll spend money at restaurants and will shop in Greenport's local like shops. It's great. We love all that. However, like progress is also like where's cultural institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, thank God there's a movie theater that's like supposed to open this year,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like let's
Yeah.
get more of those events. Libraries, like let's continue programming. Public art, festivals, abilities, music, writing, like in investment, like capital investment. So from a financial standpoint in the arts is super important, but also creative investment. And so getting people interested in those kinds of things, that was something that, you know, when we go back to like the first question you'd asked me is like, or one of the first is that's what got me interested in this area, is that I was able to be that like that quirky kid in a place where like half my peers drove pickup trucks for no reason, right? Like they drove pickup trucks and had nothing in the pickup.
Mm-hmm.
But like that was the culture out here. It was like you're a farmer, you're a fisherman, you're an oysterman, you're, you know, you work a blue collar job, and that's all great. And again, that's the mutual respect. I respect that. And is there room for like to be that quirky person? And so I think there's got to be a lot more conversation about how to upkeep that, because when there's an over promotion of commerce, business commerce, things also get really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And artists cannot afford to live here. Most people cannot afford to live here.
Yeah.
So that's the conversation I'd have.
Yeah, kind of balance out the money that's coming out here, and how do you kind of slow that down when it's operated more in that regards, and then the people might look for what's the biggest profit, and the cultural aspect of the arts might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but then you're losing an important aspect that would make the community more well-rounded
Yes.
than just focusing on businesses and other.
Well, and it's also visibility, right? So
yeah.
it's like for a long time, these towns have worked off almost like a 2-season calendar,
Mm-hmm.
where everything flourishes in spring, summer, maybe early fall. It's like 2.5 season calendar. And that's where all the business comes in, and that's where people make their money, and that's where people rent their houses, etc. And then, as you know, anyone who's lived out here is like, and then it dies in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's great. I think slowing down the winter is awesome, but does it have to die? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is there a place where people who live here full time in the winter, early spring, late fall, can have a community to go to? And so some of these things that are happening, like Winterfest in Southold, is great. Like, so that's the visibility standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these are businesses that are here year round, and let's give them a place to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can support each other from business perspective outside of those 2.5 seasons, but then also from a creative perspective, creativity, like it birthed some real innovation. And so you have a bunch of artists living in an area that is even like, let's say, going the direction the North Fork's going. People think of something. It's happened in every city you can think of that has kind of undergone that transformation. You know, Charleston. Charleston also super expensive, much bigger place, much bigger city, but
Mm-hmm.
still has those kinds of areas. Pittsburgh, absolutely. Asheville. Again, I'm talking about bigger cities, but these are also cities that have undergone huge economic transformations, but have also allowed a space for art and creativity to flourish, and people come up with some amazing solutions. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I hope that can continue.
Mm-hmm. And just lastly, you mentioned that you're working on a second book.
Mm-hmm.
Could you discuss a little bit about that, or do you want to keep that under under wrap.
I have a weird superstition about talking about stuff before I'm like finished with the first draft, because then I'll feel like I'll never finish. But it is way different than my first book. It has plot. There's a lot of plot in this one. And it's I'll just say it concerns a tech entrepreneur, a research scientist, a journalist, a hedge fund manager, a research pool of old people, and a reality show. That's all I can say.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Nice. And did you want to mention anything more about your book?
The Longitude of Grief, comes out on May 14th, which is a Tuesday, and it is supposedly you can order it wherever books are sold. I know Burton's is going to carry some, but you can also order it from bookshop.org, which supports indie bookstores, which is actually pretty cool. So like you could type in your zip code and it will show the indie bookstores nearest you, and it will order that book to the bookstore or to ship to you directly. A higher percentage goes to authors and to the bookstores themselves versus somewhere like Amazon, where you can also order my book, but Amazon is Amazon and takes a much higher percentage. But yeah, I'm excited. I hope people can read it and enjoy it, and hopefully spread the good word.
Nice. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and telling your story. And it was really nice to hear some of the processes with your writing and also your involvement in the community, being a firefighter. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, Christopher, and thank you for letting me ramble. It was much appreciated. Your generosity is much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 64 with Matthew Daddona. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.